get into the actual layers palette in Photoshop, I want to talk about what Photoshop is attempting to do by using layers. What layers do in Photoshop is they emulate tracing paper. So let's say that we've got this one piece of tracing paper here with this object on it. This would be equivalent to having one layer in Photoshop with this green triangle on it. Now, if you're unfamiliar with what tracing paper is essentially paper that you can see through, just like this. And there's a variety of different uses for this artistically. As the name indicates, it's used for tracing a lot of the time. So let's say that we've got this one piece of tracing paper and we want to add an object to this, but we don't want to actually draw on this piece of tracing paper. Well, what we can do is we can add another piece of tracing paper over that and have this object. Now it looks as if we have two objects that have been drawn on the same piece of paper. I know it doesn't necessarily look that realistic here, but bear with me. And now we've got both of these objects here, and they're still independent of one another. In other words, they are two separate objects. So what we could do next is, if we wanted to add more to this, we could go ahead and we could do this. So we've now added this kind of pink circle here, in addition to this kind of rust-colored square and the green triangle. If this were just one sheet of paper and we wanted to move any of this around, or we wanted to get rid of one of these, it would take a lot of doing. We would have to erase things and so on. But as you can see here, I can move these objects independently of one another, or I can actually get rid of an object altogether, just like we got rid of that square. And let's say then that we want to move this pink circle over to the green triangle. We can do this. And if we wanted to, we could re-add this square back in. This is the advantage of working with layers in Photoshop. Let's say that we wanted to turn this object on its side. We could do that independently of the other objects, and it doesn't affect the other objects. Let's say that we wanted to remove everything except for the pink circle. And we wanted to add the brown rectangle there. And then we wanted to come in and re-add in the triangle, but we wanted to do it on its side. What layers allow us to do is to work with objects independently as if they were on separate sheets of tracing paper. This is an incredibly powerful tool. So hopefully, if you didn't understand the basic concept of what layers are trying to do, that little demonstration kind of helped. Photoshop is essentially trying to digitally represent tracing paper. So let's talk about the Photoshop window. Right now you can see here that you've got a few different key areas in this window. One of them is going to be the kind of the blending options up here. There are layer locking options. You've got the layers themselves. Over here, we've got the hamburger menu. You click on that, you're going to have a lot of different options in here. And then down at the bottom, you've got very commonly used functions, which is like create new layers, organizational folders, and then some special effects and masking. One of the things that you need to realize about this window, along with most other functions in Photoshop, is that there are multiple ways to do exactly what we're going to talk about. And I'm not going to cover all of those multiple ways. For example, you can create new layers by clicking on this button. You can also create new layers by going under the hamburger menu. And then there's also over here, there is a menu item called layers that also has a lot of options under there that repeat in these two different areas. In addition to this, you can also use keyboard shortcuts for a lot of this. How you do this is up to you, but we're going to talk about the main overall arcing functions in layers. So let's talk then about, first of all, this background layer and what exactly this background layer is. Whenever you create a new document in Photoshop, what ends up happening is You choose your width, your height, your resolution, but you also choose a background color. And let's actually just do, we're going to do 11 by 8.5, 300 pixels per square inch. And we're going to choose white as our background. So what comes up is exactly what we had before. We've got a white background, which equals a white canvas over here. But if we went in and we created a new document, and we instead had this as transparent, what ends up happening is that you have what's referred to as just layer 1 instead of a background, and you can see it has this checkerboard. Remember, whenever you see the checkerboard, what that means is it means transparency. Photoshop has to have something to indicate nothing. The checkerboard is Photoshop's equivalent to the number 0. You have to have something to represent nothing. That's what a 0 is. In Photoshop, that equivalent is a checkerboard. And you can see here, if we've just got an untitled document, you can't just have white represent nothing, because white can be something. It can be this background layer. So that's why you would see this if you create a new document and you have nothing chosen as the background. Now, when we create a new layer, and you would do this with this little icon that's right down here, in the later versions of Photoshop, especially in these later versions of the Creative Cloud, you've got a little square with a plus in it. For years, it was just a little page icon that was down there. Instead, they both do exactly the same thing. So if you're working in an older version of Photoshop, that's what that little icon is. It's the same thing as this. They've just updated the interface in the last few years. So I'm going to click on this, and when I do, you can see what happens is that we get what is referred to as a layer 1, and we've got this background. Now, the first thing that I want you to notice about this is that we have that checkerboard. Over here in the canvas, it doesn't look like we have that checkerboard, but we do. And what this is saying is this is basically like saying we now have a piece of tracing paper laying on top of a white table. And this checkerboard indicates that that piece of tracing paper is transparent. So remember, we have to have something to indicate nothing. And let's go ahead and just kind of emulate what was done in the tracing paper demo. So I'm just going to create a shape here. Let's create that triangle. And I'm not going to go into the specifics of how I'm creating these shapes and so on. This is really just a layers video. So let's just stick to this. So I've got this triangle here, and if we look at the layer, we can see now we have an object on that transparent layer. So we now have an object essentially on our piece of tracing paper. So one of the things that I want to do is I want to go in and I want to name this. You can see it says layer 1, but I want to name this triangle. Now, the way that you do this is you move your cursor over the name of the layer and you double click and it'll highlight, and you can go in and you can type the name of the layer. Now, what you need to remember about this, because this is a sticking point for people who first get into Photoshop, is that if you don't click exactly on the name, what will end up happening is if you double click out here instead of on the name, you're going to end up with a layer style window. That's a very common thing for people to do when they first start working in Photoshop. If this happens, just hit cancel. Make sure that your cursor is actually over the name, double click on it, and then you can name it. So let's kind of move on and let's create those other objects that we saw in that demo. So I'm going to go down here again to this plus icon. I'm going to create another layer. Let's go ahead and create this rust colored square. And again, I'm going to go up in here and Let me just kind of zoom in so you can see this a little bit better. I'm going to double click on the name and I'm going to name it square, hit return, and now that's named. And we'll do that last one, which is that pink circle. I'm going to hit that little page icon again, the little plus, and I'm going to put this pink circle on here. And just like the others, I'm going to go in and I'm going to name this. So this essentially emulates what we had with that tracing paper. Now, what I'm going to do is go to the Move tool, and you're going to see that even though this looks as if this is 3 objects on one canvas, what it really is 3 separate objects floating above a white canvas. So if I go in with the Move tool and I click on, let's say, the pink circle here, I can move it. If I go over to the layers and let's say click on the green triangle, and I can move it. And if I want to, I can do the same thing then with the square. The other thing that I can do, very similar to what you saw in that tracing paper demo, is I can actually move these objects above one another or below one another. So if I want to move this triangle above, actually above the circle and the square, what I can do is I can just click on this layer, and you'll see that when I go to move it, it kind of has a grasping hand, and I can move this above all of these layers, and you can see that there's that little light blue line that indicates where we're going to put this. And if I let go, the triangle is above the other shape. What I want you to be aware of is that if auto select is checked, so if it looks like this, what this will allow you to do is click on an object and it will automatically move you to whichever layer that object is on over here. So if I click on this rust-colored square, it will automatically move to that layer. So if I do the same thing with, let's say, the green triangle, it will move to it. If I do it with the circle, it will do that as well. The reason I want you to know this is because if I am correct, it's been a while since I freshly installed Photoshop on a machine. I believe that auto select may be by default checked, which means that whenever you click on an object, it's going to move to whatever layer that is. This can be very confusing to people who first install Photoshop and first start to use it. So I always recommend, if you're brand new to this and you want to start, and you're trying to understand layers and so on, I would go in and I would actually uncheck auto select until you become more comfortable with it. Let's talk about this icon again down here, this little plus icon. This plus icon essentially does 2 things. We know one of the things that it does already, which is if we click it, it will create a new blank layer. But the other thing that it does, and I'm just going to undo that, the other thing that it does is it duplicates things. So if I want, let's say, 2 triangles instead of just 1, I can click on this layer and hold down and drag the layer down to that icon and let go. And now you can see what we've got. We've got a triangle copy in addition to the triangle. And you can do this multiple times. You can have up to 100 layers in the layers palette in Photoshop. So if I wanted another one, I could do this as well. And I can move each one of these independently with the Move tool. So if I wanted to move these around, I could. You can also name these individual things and so on. It works just like any other layer. The other thing that I want you to see is that you can also get rid of layers. So if we look at down here next to that page icon, we've got the little trash can. It does exactly what you think it does. It gets rid of layers. So there are basically 2 ways that you can do this. You can either drag that layer down to the trash can and it will get rid of it automatically, or if you have a layer highlighted and you click on the trash can, It'll say, do you want to delete this? You can also click on here and say, don't show again. But it'll say, do you want to delete this? If you hit yes, it deletes it. So, there are at least two ways for you to be able to get rid of layers that you don't want. And I'm sure that there are keyboard shortcuts that you can set up and use as well. Let's look at this third one down here then, which is this little folder. Now, what the folder does, let's go ahead and click on it. What it does is it creates this quarter-sized layer, and it calls it group 1, and it shows a little folder next to it. So let's say that we did want to duplicate the triangle a bunch of times. Let's duplicate it, just 2 or 3 times. And we can move them around and so on. But now you can see what we have here is we've got kind of a cluttered look to our layers palette over here. So let's say that we just want to keep all the triangles together. We want to know where they are, but we don't need to see every layer with a triangle on it. Well, what we can do is we can move these layers into this little folder. And you can see here what this does is it puts them all in the folder, and then it kind of justifies them to the right. And this space here is basically indicating that they are inside of this group. And if I click on this little triangle next to the folder, it will close it. Now, you can see here, they all still exist over here. And if I click on this little arrow again, it'll expand the folder, and it expands and closes folders just like you do in any operating system working with a folder and in looking in list view. So with this, we can go in and we can organize layers in different ways and so on. The cool thing about this is that we can actually move this group, and it will affect the items that are over here in the in the canvas. So if I want to put these back up here, I can. If I want to go in and I want to throw away one of these, I can do it. I could actually throw the entire group away as well if I wanted to. The other thing, and I would really encourage you to do this, is that you can name them just like you name any other object that's in the layers palette. You just double click on the name, type out, hit return, and it'll name it. And so now we can kind of just treat this like any other object. And if we don't want to see all these triangles, or whatever it is, then we can go ahead and close this, and we can have a much cleaner palette that we can look at and work with. So what you'll see here is that in the layers palette, we've got all of these little eyeballs that are next to the layer group and all the individual layers and so on. What that is for, it gives you the ability to turn those objects off, these layers off, without getting rid of them. So let's say that I want to get rid of a few of these triangles. I can click the little eyeball next to them, and I could turn those off. Now they still exist, so if I want them again, I can go in and click on these, and we'll get to see it again. But if I don't want it, I can do that. The cool thing about the layer groups is that if I don't want to see anything in that group, I can go ahead and click on this, and it will get rid of everything in there. If I have 70 layers inside of that folder and I don't want to see them, then I don't have to see them. The other thing that you want to know about these layer groups is that not only can you work with them like a layer, but you can also duplicate them. So now we've got twice as many. It doesn't look like it on the canvas at the moment because we basically just duplicated these, but if we want to go in and move these, you can see here, we can. And the other thing that we can do is we can also get rid of them if we want to. So we could drag this entire folder down to the trash, and it will delete everything in it. The next button that we have here are what are referred to as adjustment layers. And adjustment layers are interesting because they have a corresponding menu under Image to Adjustments. And many of these options that you see here are also in here. However, they don't work exactly the same way. And let me show you what I mean by this. Okay, so I've got this image of kind of a close-up of a sunflower here. And if I go under Image to Adjustments, you can see we've got all of these different image manipulation functions. And most of them have to deal with brightness and contrast and color and so on. So let's just pick one of them. Let's just say that we want to do hue and saturation. And without going into the specifics of what hue and saturation does, let's just really kind of shift the color a lot. We hit OK. What I want you to know about this is that if we save this and close the document and reopen it back up, it's going to look like this. What we've done is what's called destructive editing to an image. In other words, we're actually changing the image permanently. I mean, we could go under Edit to undo, and we could undo it that way. But the problem with that is that if I save this document the way it is and close it and then open it back up, we can't undo it. We can't go under Edit to undo and get the image back the way that it was. And this is destructive editing. You're changing the image and you're doing it permanently. So you want to be careful with this, and this is why you always want to work on duplicates of photos or artwork or whatever else. But this is kind of a very destructive way of editing. If I wanted to readjust this and I go under Image to Adjustments again to Hue and Saturation, if you'll notice, these sliders that I use to adjust this to turn this blue from yellow to blue, they are zeroed out again. So I can't quickly undo what I did, even in the window that I used to do it. So let me just go ahead and undo this, just to turn it back yellow here. And let's look at the adjustment layers. And you can see here, hue and saturation is under here as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this. And essentially, two things happen. One, instead of hue and saturation opening up in a separate window over in here, it's just a little tab, a properties tab that opens up here. And more importantly, instead of just adjusting the image, we now have a hue and saturation adjustment layer. So let's go in and let's do the exact same thing that I did on the last one, which was turn this blue. And I'm going to do this. The tool works as far as the sliders go exactly the same way. The big difference is that that adjustment now, instead of being applied to the photograph itself, that adjustment is actually now applied just to this layer. And if I turn the little eyeball on and off next to it, you can see here that adjustment can be turned on and off. More importantly is that if I double click on this, you can now see those adjustments are still there, and I can readjust these if I want to. I can bring this back to the way that it was when I first applied the adjustment. Most importantly is that if I save this and close it and then reopen it, this adjustment is still here and I can get rid of it. I can adjust it. I can do whatever I want. It's a non-destructive way of editing. I'm not changing the actual image. That is the big deal with using these adjustments over using the ones that are under Image to Adjustments. There are pros and cons for using the menu versus using the adjustment layers. This is not the time to really discuss that, but just know that they're both there and know what they do. The next function that I want to talk about in the layers window is this one right here, which is this kind of little rectangle with the circle in it. And these are what are referred to as layer masks. Now, I'm going to do a whole video on layer masking later. I'm not going to expect you to really fully comprehend this, but I want you to know it's here. Let me demo this and show you what this tool isn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to the toolbar and I'm going to choose the eraser. And the eraser does exactly what you think it does. It erases objects in Photoshop. So if I click down and I move the brush across the object here, you can see it's erasing it. And if I turn off the background, you can see that this transparency goes right through that object now, and we've erased it. Now the problem with this is, and this is a really great tool, and I use this tool every day, the problem is that this is really destructive. This is a situation where you are getting rid of things, and unless you go back in to undo immediately, or you use the history palette while it's open, you're not going to get this back. So if I save this document and reopen it, that information is gone. In the context of, a simple square that's kind of rust colored, that's not a difficult thing to redo. But if we're talking about editing a photograph or a piece of artwork where you've erased something that you shouldn't have erased, that is a much more difficult situation to remedy. So there is a different way of doing this. It's more complex, but it offers a variety of really great choices when it comes to erasing and blending things. So I'm just going to undo these, and we're going to talk about this. We're going to click on this little icon here, which adds a layer mask, and two important things happen. And I'm going to bring the toolbar over here. We've got a foreground and background color, that pink and kind of red, and we've got our layer right here, which just has that square on it. When I click this, two important things happen. One is that we get a second little white window next to the object, and the color picker is changed to absolute black and absolute white. Now, if you'll notice in the layers, you can see that the mask is highlighted because it has those little white lines around the corners. And if I click on the actual thumbnail, you can see this is now highlighted. And notice what happened when I clicked on that. The color picker changed back to the way that it was. I click on the mask, the color picker goes to black and white. I click on the actual thumbnail, it goes back to the way that it originally was. The reason for this is because the layer mask uses black, white, and gray. It uses it to erase, but also to unerase objects. So if you use any tool that essentially uses a brush and lays down paint onto a canvas, and I'm just going to use the paintbrush for this, you can use a layer mask. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make black my foreground color. I'm on the layer mask here. You can see because it's highlighted, and I'm going to go over into the canvas and I'm just going to start to paint down. So you can see here what's happening is I'm erasing, and if I turn off that background layer, you can see I've now erased that. However, if we look at the layers, it's a little bit different than when we used the eraser, because the object itself doesn't look like anything's happened to it. It still looks like a full square. Whereas on the layer mask, we now have those three brush strokes that I just did. And the reason for that is because we can now undo this. And this is the really important and very powerful part of this tool, is that if I make the foreground white and I go in here and I start to paint the object, I can now unerase it. This is incredibly powerful, and it's very important that eventually you understand and you really master layer masking, because this is absolutely the best way to blend objects together and to non-destructively edit images when you have to remove some of the pixels. The other thing about this is that this concept also carries on to other tools. So the one that we just looked at, the adjustment layers. If we look at this adjustment layer it's not just the little adjustment that you can see here in gray that's got the little gradients. It's not just that. What we have to the right of it is we've got a mask. We've got a layer mask on there. Now, why would you have that on what is essentially an adjustment? Because the same principles apply. If I click on the mask, you can see it highlights, it turns the foreground and background to black and white. And now if I paint onto this mask on this adjustment layer with black, I'll now remove that color adjustment. And if I want to bring that back, I can just make the foreground color white, and then I can bring it back. There are a lot of really powerful applications for using layer masks, as well as just masking involved in other areas in Photoshop. And what you'll eventually find if you spend enough time in Photoshop is that everything in the background of Photoshop really works on this concept of black, white, and gray. And what I mean gray with this, if black erases absolutely, white unerases absolutely, what gray tends to do is it just does it halfway. So it's just kind of erasing. It's making it translucent. So very powerful stuff. And it's a situation where I will definitely be making a video on this later because it's such an important function in Photoshop. Okay, so this next one then, the effects window, you can bring this up at least two different ways. The easiest is to come down here and you can choose which one of these you want. However, if you remember back to when I was saying, if you don't actually double click on the layer name in a layer to name it, that you'll accidentally bring up a window, that's the other way that you can bring this effects window up. You just double click anywhere on the layer that you want to apply it to. Now, what this has is this has a lot of commonly used special effects. And there are a million different ways to use these things. There are ways to use them very effectively and then ways to use them where they look really awful. I encourage you to look at a lot of different tutorials online for this. YouTube has got a million tutorials where you can use these things very effectively. I'm not going to go into the specifics of what this does, but what I'll do is I'll just show you one or two functions. So let's say that the triangle here, I want to put like a bevel on this. What I could do is click on bevel and emboss, and I can create a bevel on this. And I can change the light direction of it and so on. If I want to put a stroke on this, I can. Now, the thing that confuses people is that they'll actually click the little radio button and check mark this, let's say to cover color overlay, let's just say here, and they'll do that, but the options over here don't change. And that's because just clicking on the button and checking it, it just turns that on. It doesn't actually give you the options over here. To do that, you actually have to click on the name itself, and then you would have those options. If I hit OK with this, then you can see here, now underneath that layer, for one, we have a little FX indication over here. And then down here, we've got effects, bevel and emboss, stroke, and color overlay, all the things that I used. I could turn any of these off. I could turn them all off. I could hide them by clicking on this little arrow, and it basically hides them. But we know that there's an effects because we have that marker right here. And I can also just grab these and just throw them all away, or individual ones away if I want to. Okay, so the last one down here is this little chain. Now what this does, if we shift click on layers, you can see here, I've got these two layers now are selected. And down here, what was grayed out before is a little bit lighter now, and it says link layers. So if I click on this, you can see over here in the layers, we now get two little chains associated with these layers. What this does is it links those layers together. So if I just go to the move tool, and let's say that I click on the rust colored square here and I do this, it's going to move both of those. So what it's doing is it's basically saying we're going to treat both of these layers like they're one layer, like there are two objects on one layer. And we're going to move those. If we wanted to move all three of these, we could shift click all three, link them, and now we could move all three of them together. And anytime you clicked on any of them, you could move them all together. And then of course you could go in and unchain whichever ones you want, and then move those independently. When you would want to use this is if you've got something exactly lined up the way that you want it, but you need to move several objects and you don't want to really mess up that orientation that you had those objects in, you can just link them all together and move them. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about are these blending options that are up here, and we'll talk a little bit about the locking options here in a moment. So the blending options that you have up here, we've got opacity and we've got fill. Fill has to do more with those special effects that I just showed you. So we're not going to really talk about fill at the moment, but we're going to talk about opacity and we're going to talk about the blending modes. And the blending modes are right here. Now, the blending modes, as you can see, have various effects on the layers that you're working on. And there are very specific things that these blending modes do. Like, for example, overlay will make dark parts of a layer darker, lighter parts lighter, and it will ignore everything that is close to gray. You know, things that are like that. And each one of them has a function, and each one is really powerful depending upon the situation that you want to use them in. Again, this is not a video where I'm going to go into each one of these. There are a lot of videos that describe what each one of these do. My advice is that you actually use these and kind of test these as much as you can, because you can get some very, very cool effects and some very powerful effects using these. By default, it is on normal, and you're going to actually find these blending modes in a variety of different areas. You're going to find them in, if we go to the paintbrush, you can see here, we also have the modes over here. So you can change the paintbrush into those different modes. You've got them as blending modes in your layers. You've got them in a lot of different places. The opacity is based on a 0 to 100% scale. And you can see here at 60%, kind of see through the triangle here. If I reduce the opacity on the circle, you can see we can kind of see through the circle now, and we could do the same thing with the square. And now we can kind of see through all of those. Now, one of the things that you need to know, though, is that Photoshop doesn't just randomly give you these colors where these are overlapping. It actually treats these colors almost like photo filtration. These are reacting in the way that if you actually had some photo filters that were these colors and you put them over one another, that they would actually react that way. So it's not just a random thing that's happening here. This is Photoshop accurately calculating the way that these colors would interact if they were translucent. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about these locking functions that are up in here. Let me zoom in a little bit to the entire screen. So if we have lock all, what this is essentially doing is it's just completely locking the layer. And you can see here that you've got this little white lock that's over here. And it disables any type of editing for that layer. And there are a lot of different occasions when you would want to do this, where you would want to lock layers, especially if you have a lot of layers that you're working on and you just don't want to touch specific areas of an image, this is the way that you could do it. To unlock it, you would just click on it again and unlock it. We're not going to get into the auto nesting as far as artboards go because that requires us to talk about artboards, so we're going to ignore that for right now. This next one here, this actually locks the position of the object that is on the layer. So you can see here I'm trying to move this green triangle, but it has locked the position. This one right here, this locks image pixels. So I'm going to zoom out just a little so that we can talk about these first two, just so that you can really understand what they do. The lock image pixels, what this does is it allows you to move whatever is on the layer, but you can't actually edit this. So if I go in with the paintbrush, you can see here, it says could not use brush tool because the layer is locked. So the actual image or pixels that make up the object on the layer, you can move them around. You can do those types of things, but you cannot actually alter those pixels. The next one that's on here, and this is a really great option that they have in Photoshop, which is essentially an alpha lock. If you click on this, what it does is it does what is referred to as locking transparent pixels. So in other words, you have all of the pixels on a layer that are transparent, and then you have the actual object itself. If we lock the transparent pixels, it means that if we have let's say a paintbrush like this, and I go to paint anywhere where the transparent pixels are, I can't because those are locked. Where it's not transparent is where the object is. So if I click out here and I drag, you can see I can paint on the pixels. I can't paint on transparent ones. Where this is really useful is, let's say that we only do want to paint on the triangle here. If I don't have the transparent pixels locked, I'm going to have to make selections. You can see it's like you can't. I couldn't have chosen two more obnoxious colors, by the way. If I wanted to just do inside the triangle, I would have to use different selection tools and so on. Whereas with this, if I click on Lock Transparent Pixels, I can then only paint on the object itself. If you get into a lot of painting or just digital illustration in Photoshop, this is a huge time saver and a really great function in Photoshop. And you can find this in a lot of other different graphics programs as well. This isn't something that is inherent only to Photoshop. You just need to know that that's there. Let's turn the other layers on and let's talk about this hamburger menu here. Again, there's a lot that is in here that is repeated in the layers menu that's over here. There are a few things in here that I definitely think are very important. We're not going to go over every one of these different options. Instead, I just want to cover just a few so that you know that these options are here. The three that I really want to concentrate on are going to be these: the merge down, merge visible, and flatten image. Let's start with flatten image. So what flatten image does is it takes a file that has all of these different layers on it and it flattens it. So now all the layers are gone. What you have to be very careful with when you do this is that you don't save whatever original document that you're working on over itself and then close it. I have seen this happen a lot over my years of teaching, where students will actually flatten an image. They will just instinctively save, and then they have none of their layers. Now, why you would want to flatten an image like this, it really comes down to image size. So what I want to do is move down here to the lower left-hand corner of Photoshop. We're going to talk about document sizes here. What you can see here is that we've got two different document sizes. We've got 24.1 megs and 54.6 megs. The difference between those two, the reason that there are two, is because the first number is the document when it's flattened. So the 24.1 megs is the document flattened. The document with the layers is 54.6 megs. And you can see this change if I just go in and duplicate a layer and we go back down to here, you can see it's now 22.1 megs flat, but it's 77.2 megs with the layers. I've got documents where if they're flat, they're 400 megs, let's say. But with all the layers, some of the illustrations that I've done are so complex and have so many layers, and the size is so big that I'm looking at like 2-3 gigabyte files when I include all the layers. There's a very big difference between something that is flattened and something that isn't, especially if you want to send something to a printer, or if you just want to work with it in a way that is going to be a little bit easier to a printing service, whatever else. You want to send flattened images. Just make sure you don't save the original over itself flattened, because once you close that document and open it back up, there's no way to get the layers back. So that's what happens when you flatten. The other ones in here, we have merge down. Let's say that we have the circle here highlighted and we go to merge down. What this does is it merges, let's undo that so you can see it. It merges the layer that you're on and the layer that is below it. So let's go through there again and we'll do merge down, and it merges those two together. And you can do this multiple times. Let's say that we click on the green triangle here and we do merge down, and we could do merge down again. And now you can see that they're all on one layer. I'm just going to quickly undo that. Now, the merge visible, what this does is it looks at the document and it will merge everything together that has the little eyeball on next to the layer. So let's say that I wanted to merge all three of these objects together quickly, but I didn't want them merged with the background. If I click on this little eyeball and turn the background off and I go merge visible, it will merge everything that had the eyeball on next to it. So let's say that we didn't have the eyeball on next to the pink circle here, and we did this. We'll merge visible. Now it merges everything but that. Where this is really very convenient is that if you've got a very complex, large image, if you've got 80 different layers in it and you've got a ton turned off because you've duplicated layers and you've done different editing and so on, and you want to merge everything that is visible into one layer, that's one of the ways to do it. Now, there is an additional kind of secret keyboard shortcut that I think is incredibly valuable for people to know. So instead of, let's say instead of merging visible and merging all of those together like this, if we go to merge visible, but you hold down the Option key, what this will do is it will make a duplicate of all of the layers that are currently on and flatten those duplicates. So you can see here, now we've merged everything that's visible into one layer, but we still kept the other ones. What I use this for is if I'm doing a really big illustration and I want to see everything merged down, or I need for everything to be merged down into one layer, but I need to keep the original ones as well. If you hold down Option and you do that, it will merge everything into one layer and duplicate it. Or it will duplicate everything and merge it into one layer. Okay, and so that is the overview of the Photoshop layers window. By no means is this a 100% in-depth look at every little part of the layers window. But what this is meant to do is it's meant to give you a really great overview of the layers window and just the capability of what you can do in Photoshop in conjunction with this window. I get a lot of people who are first starting to learn Photoshop or who just avoid it because they don't understand layers and they don't understand what all of these things do. Hopefully this will provide a really great kind of overview of what these things do and will give you some type of an indication of what areas you want to concentrate on more thoroughly.